Good evening or afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is George Blaustein. I will be moderating this event. First, let me give thanks to Jetske Brouwer for roping me into this event as the moderator, and I will be glad to be sharing this stage with Liang de Beer and Dan Afrifa, who will join us after, and I'll introduce them later in the program. It falls to me to introduce this book, but in some quarters, like mine, I teach American Studies at the University of Amsterdam. All God's Dangers, The Life of Nate Shaw needs no introduction because it is now a classic text. We might call it an inimitable text, a monument of social and political history, and, just as importantly, of a literary voice. Among other honors, it received a National Book Award in 1975, although I do not think that mere prestige is a reason to read anything. Here is the moment when I confess that I myself had not read this book until last week. Ted, I hope you will forgive me. When I was asked to moderate this event, I said yes, not because I am an expert on the subject. I am not, nor on the practice of oral history, but because it was a chance finally to fill that gap in my reading. Insofar as oral history is itself one of our subjects, I want to begin by quoting Professor Rosengarten's own interrogation of the term, this is from an essay written in 1979. Here he is. I never considered myself an oral historian, nor the field I was working in oral history. I have always felt that the term is misleading, condescending, and plain bad speech. Oral history stresses the means, not the end, and it does a poor job at that. The technique involved is more aural, A-U-R-A-L, more aural than oral, though oral history won't do either. When you think of social history or political history, you have a pretty good notion that you are dealing with recognizable people and institutions. But oral history tells you nothing of the historian's special area of concern, which can be as varied as that of the historian who works from written artifacts. Oral history suggests a fad, like 3D movies or see-through clothing. But in fact, it has been around a very long time. Oral history is the incarnation of the ancestor of all written histories, the epic poem. Of course, not all histories are epics. Of course, not all oral histories are epics, and some epics are epic bores. Now that I have finally read this strange marvel of a book, which somehow smacks at once of epic, myth, and social realism, I get to introduce it. So I want to read a few short passages to give us the texture of it, because it might need some introduction here. The book's origin lay in a young Ted Rosengarten's research into the Alabama Sharecroppers Union of the 1930s. In 1969, he discovered Ned Cobb, then 84 years old, who had been an early member of that union. Ted would record Cobb's story, and the result is this autobiography of an illiterate man. And we will come back to that term, illiterate, in our discussion. We only get to the Sharecroppers Union, the book's initial reason for being, we only get to that moment just over halfway through the book, and it feels like a pivot. I'll read that part. And this is now Nate Shaw / Ned Cobb's voice. And during the pressure years, a union began to operate in this country. Call it the Sharecroppers Union. That was a nice name, I thought. And my first knowing about this union, this organization, that riot came off at Cranes Ford in '31, I looked deep in that thing, too. I heard more than I seed, and I taken that in consideration. And I knowed what was going on was a turnabout of the Southern man, white and colored. It was something unusual. And I heard about it being an organization for the poor class of people. That's just what I wanted to get into, too. I wanted to know the secrets of it enough that I could become in the knowledge of it. Secrets, knowledge. Secrets are a theme of the book. Divulged secrets or not divulged secrets. In December 1932, Nate Shaw / Ned Cobb will be shot in a standoff with white Alabamans. He'll be arrested and imprisoned for 12 years, though the prison section of the book is not at all what a reader might expect. This passage stood out with me, speaking of secrets. This is how he describes that experience of being shot. They, the shooters, hitched up to their ass wagon and took off. And 5 minutes after that man shot me 3 times, I was standing in that door looking out. My feet was just sloshing in blood. Now, if that ain't the truth ain't never been told. I was just burnt up with shot. Wonder they hadn't shot my secrets out. It's a great line. I wonder they hadn't shot my secrets out. The title, All God's Dangers, appears once in the book in a passage about the boll weevil, the insect that devastated the cotton industry in the early 20th century. Yes, our narrator says, all God's dangers ain't a white man. When the boll weevil starts in your cotton and you go to deposit it, and when the boll weevil starts in your cotton and go to depositing his eggs in them squares, that's when he'll kill you. There follows several stunning pages cataloging worms, bugs, and agricultural strategies, not unlike a chapter of Moby Dick leaping from some quotidian process of the whaling industry to a flight of metaphysics. These pages will culminate in one of the book's greatest theological paragraphs, which happens as well to be among its greatest paragraphs about politics. Here's Nate Shaw / Ned Cobb again. I can't hate God's pesters. Hate God's pesters, definitely, because they doing what God put him here to do. The boll weevil, he's a smart bird, sure as you born, and he's here for a purpose. Who knows that purpose? And who is it human that can say for sure he knows his own purpose? He got all the wisdom and knowledge God gave him, and God even suffering him to get a book learning and like that. And what the boll weevil can do to me ain't half so bad as what a man might do. I can go to my field and shake a poison dust on my crop, and the boll weevil will sail away. But how can I sling a man off my back? If we are looking for political leaders, political levers in grammar itself, one could do worse than the prefix dis, which takes on its own curious power in the text. Of white boss's orders, at one point, Shaw / Cobb says, well, that's disrecognizing me. Disrecognized, discounted in every walk of life. Disrecognized appears, also disregarded, dispossess. The first dis prefix that stuck out to me is early in the book when our narrator reflects on the history of black voting in the U.S. He says, I never voted. I was right there with my neck under the yoke like the rest of them. I wanted to vote, but I didn't want to vote if my vote weren't no good, weren't worth a doggone. What I going to for? Just voting the other man's way, just like sugar in the bowl for him. They tell me now I can vote, and I believe I could, but I've been disencouraged so bad. There's another version of disencouraged. I can't think of a moment where our narrator, Nate Shaw / Ned Cobb, forgets anything, but he does every once in a while disremember something. This is another one of the good words in the story. This is not a book to disremember, and we're here to commemorate the Dutch, or to celebrate, I should say, the Dutch translation of it, and look back on a book not to be disremembered. I hope this little introduction I've done gives some good texture for our conversation and introduces some terms that we will take up in a conversation that I will try to moderate for the moment. Please join me in welcoming Theodore Rosengarten.
George, why don't we just read the book? Well, it's really a thrill to be here this evening, to see old friends, and I hope new ones as well, and to discuss All God's Dangers, Die Kleur van Katoen. I've had connections in the Netherlands for several decades, so it feels like I'm bringing the book home, really. I've been coming really every other year. I bring a group of college students from South Carolina on the third leg of a trip we call Tracing the Holocaust. We start in Poland, we have started in Ukraine, Poland, Germany, and come to the Netherlands. It's always an interracial group, and by the time we get to Amsterdam, the discussion has turned to race. And we've had probably our most feisty discussions here and memorable discussions in Amsterdam. Also, both of my sons, my two sons, have worked in the Netherlands. My older son is a biologist and works closely with now clients, but colleagues in Leiden. And my youngest son worked for a period of time in The Hague at the International Criminal Court on the Special Court for Sierra Leone. He had an amazing job, really. He was transcribing the testimonies of people from Sierra Leone at the trial of Charles Taylor. He was the only non-lawyer on Charles Taylor's defense team. And he, because of where he grew up, because my children grew up in an African-American community in South Carolina that still speaks Gullah, a patois, which because the only really Creole language that developed in the South. He understood the Sierra Leone patois as if it was home. And that was his job, was to translate these testimonies. But again, I think I want to start by with a quote from the great French historian Marc Bloch, who once said that the journey of a book is a subject worthy of study itself because the book follows the vicissitudes of life. And he meant both the journey of the physical book and its publishing history. And I'll say a little bit about the publishing history of All God's Dangers. I had undertaken the book originally, or the project, as a doctoral dissertation project at Harvard. But my department told me that, well, it's really not acceptable because this testimony from this illiterate, thank you for using that word, farmer, it needs a historian to mediate between the reader and him. You just can't. So I had I think, an enlightened advisor who says, forget it, leave, go do your work and see what happens. And I did. And then the book came out. I was out of school. I'd long gone. And got a telephone call from the dean of the graduate school at Harvard who said, we'd like to award you a PhD for your book. So I never got to submit those things in black binders, you know, those pages that are the normal dissertations. When the book came out finally in 1974, I can't believe it. It'll be 50 years old very soon. And it was really pushed along by the New York Times, which gave it a front page review. No one expected this. I certainly didn't expect anything like that. And for a number of reasons. For one thing, the editors were very aware that in some ways what we regard as the civil rights movement at the time was splitting and flagging. And this was an effort to bring to the public a missing voice, a missing piece. I think most Americans, like most Dutch who are interested in America, may know something about the Civil War and about Martin Luther King era, but not much about the in-between, about that long century of really of oppression and of adaptation that black people made and suffered in America from the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s to the 1970s. So, and the second reason is there were still people working at the New York Times who remembered the 1930s and 40s and for whom the sharecroppers union that Nate Shaw belonged to, they're regarded as one of the two great moral achievements of the Communist Party of the United States. And the second achievement was the support of the Abraham Lincoln Brigades in the American Civil War, in the Spanish Civil War, which where Americans went to fight on the side of the Republicans in Spain. The book appeared, as the first reviewer said, to sort of punctuate a certain kind of way of life, to give an exclamation point or a period to the era of the mule farmer and the era of the tenant farmer and sharecropper. And Nate Shaw went off to prison for 12 years in 1932, and that 12 years seared in his mind and in his memory that life of sharecropping and tenant farming. It wasn't that he continued active as we all do, you know, if we think of as people kind of normally would, but he had stopped, and that way of life stopped and again was seared in his mind. And here was the tale of it. Again, he came out of prison as what we call a mule farmer in a tractor world, and it was the old way of life which had stuck with him. Well, after the book came out, shortly afterwards, its first translation appeared, and that was in Hungary, of all places. And a translator had picked up a suppressed dialect that of Hungarian peasant farmers and had used that as the main kind of language of the text. It appeared then later soon after, in Japanese, where a Japanese scholar had come to America, knowing no English. I know this because he and his family came knocking on our door. And he was studying rural life, particularly peasant life, and went to Alabama and learned his English while translating this book. So what an English he learned. You know, this was his. I traveled in the late 1980s, 1990 to South Africa, and was incredibly proud to discover that All God's Dangers was a major text used by the great historian Charles van Anselen at the University of Witwatersrand. And here was this opportunity in the death throes of apartheid for people to go out and interview people that they'd never had before. And All God's Dangers was a kind of field guide for his students. The book was awakened in the United States during the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly in 2014, when, for its own reasons and a total surprise to us, the New York Times reviewed it again and put it on the front page again. And then the next day, it was the best-selling book in the United States for one day. The number 2 book was 100 Years of Solitude, Gabriela Marquez. Marquez had died that week. I felt terrible. I wanted to write to him and apologize for taking his spot. And then, shortly afterwards, I got an email from this man named Frans Kooymans, a translator here in the Netherlands, who wanted to know if he could translate my book. And I said, sure, please do. We had no idea what would happen afterwards, and Frans might tell us a little later about what happened and how it became. But I felt it was really the right moment. Really comes at a time when the Netherlands is discovering itself, it's rediscovering its colonial past, and in some way, All God's Dangers really kind of has caught the tail of that comet. Most recently, the book has had an unusual kind of impetus in its sales, thanks to a man who's the current governor of the state of Florida. Ron DeSantis is his name, who people who may be aware that his state of Florida has passed some new so-called standards of education in history, and is being followed by numbers of states, particularly the states that resisted the integration of their public schools. And these new standards of history are striking out of the curricula any books that are so-called divisive or make any students feel uncomfortable about their history or their past. So basically, they're wiping out books about enslavement, wiping out if you look at kind of the list of banned books, you know, some 1,500 books alone in the state of Texas, in Florida, in Arkansas, in my home state now, South Carolina, are now have been removed from school curricula, are being removed from libraries. It's interesting, when I went for the first time to Alabama, which was in actually winter of 68, 69, the chairs had been removed from the public library in Dadeville, Alabama, so that black and white children wouldn't get together at the tables. Well, the chairs are back in the library, but now the books are being removed from the library. Same library. One point I'll make and come back to is when organizers of the Sharecroppers Union came to Alabama, they came with the idea not of organizing a local union, but they came with a sense that the Black Belt counties, those counties of Alabama with a black majority that stretched into Georgia, stretched into Mississippi, constituted a political entity and a colony, in fact. And that they were going to, in fact, recognize this political entity. They wanted to organize this as its own state. Now, of course, when they got to Alabama, what they discovered is that what farmers wanted was not a large collective farm, but 40 acres and a mule, which is what, in fact, had been the dream since the kind of era of Reconstruction. Well, I want to give my colleagues here a chance to talk, but before I do that, before I give them a chance, I want to show a few slides that give sort of an indication of both the life that nature comes out of, and also of the life that my girlfriend Dale and I stepped into when, and the study of the Sharecroppers Union, by the way, was hers. Dale was a senior in college and had in Massachusetts at Radcliffe College, part of Harvard, and had decided as a senior she would do her senior thesis on this union that no one had studied before in Alabama. But mainly it was the 60s, and we had many friends who had gone to Alabama and Mississippi in the mid-1960s during what were called voter registration drives, were called Freedom Summers, and we had missed it, and we wanted to go and see what we missed. So let me see. Okay. Let's see what happens. So here's the state of Alabama in red. For people who have been to the U.S., people who are from the U.S., people who aren't from the U.S., we can see where it is. Right in, and the state is also known or calls itself, come on. You can see it in the center here of the Southeast, the heart of Dixie. There it is, bordering on Georgia, Mississippi. The original capital of the Confederate States of America was there in Montgomery. So this bus, this is what our friends who went to Alabama and Mississippi in 1963, 64, and 65 found was waiting to greet them. And this actually is the National Guard, which is protecting this bus from the locals who heard that the Freedom Riders were on their way and were going to meet them before they got to where they were going. And this is what they found when they got there. And we had friends our friends are on the ground here. They're being clubbed. I'm looking at this photo and looking at this woman on what is the left here who's being clubbed as she's down. And these were people who were protesting, they were protesting the fact that they weren't allowed to vote. And they were struggling. This is Birmingham in 1963. And these young people are being hosed by the fire department, which has been deputized by the police. And it doesn't feel like a nice spray to be hosed by fire hose, I'll tell you that. And I actually have a T-shirt from the Civil Rights Museum with this photograph on it. And my grandson, who was 6 at the time, saw that. He said, "Papa, take that off. Don't you ever put that on again. Don't you put that on again." Don't. It was very, and today it still has a lot of power. Another, let's see, I hope I can get it. A photograph's almost a work of art, isn't it? Huh? It's a photograph of people, young people mainly. These are college people from Miles College in Birmingham who are also were marching in the street for the right to vote in 1963. And in September of 63, the 16th Street Baptist Church was blown up, and these 4 young children, Denise, Cynthia, Addie Mae, Carol, were murdered. I remember driving to work. I had a job in a landscaping group in September of 63, hearing this over the news, and I had to pull off the road. And I would say this story and reactions is what got me involved into civil rights activism. Here's a picture, normal picture of people out picking cotton. The white man on the horse is an overseer. And the amazing thing to me about all the cotton is that it had to be picked by hand. And here's a family very, very much like Nashaw's family. who are out, people of all ages, men, women, picking cotton. All that cotton that's clothed us had to be picked by hand. Oops, let me go back. One. Well, this is Nachar, or Ned Cobb, and his wife, Viola, their first child, taken in 1907. The photograph by an itinerant photographer who drove around the countryside on a Sunday after church. You can see people are in their best clothes. And for 50 cents, he took their photographs. He came around a month later. For another 50 cents, he gave them prints. The only photograph of the family that survives. The photographs of the family burned in a house fire. So it's precious, but we're thinking, what about the files of this man, his plates? What kind of a history of rural life, you know, would be captured in those? More people picking cotton. This is a cotton gin. After the cotton's picked, what happens to it? Well, the seeds have to be removed from the lint, and this is the machine that does that. And Nate Shaw and Ned Cobb remembered picking cotton from the time he could stand up, because the children could get the bottom bowls, and it would save the adults from having to bend over to pick up and break their backs. And back injuries and back are the chief complaints of the people who spent their lives doing this. This is a picture of a very rational cotton farm. This is prison in Alabama, where Ned served 12 years. We can see people here, they're well clothed, they have protection from the sun, they have sacks, and they're picking. These are all prisoners who are paid a few pennies a day to pick cotton on the largest cotton farms in the state of Alabama, which were the state prisons. Let me go past. Okay, these 9 young men are the Scottsboro Boys. In 1931, these 9 young men were on a train, and they were taken off the train in northern Alabama and were accused of raping 2 white women. The reason that this is here is their sensational trials, in which, even though one of the women totally recanted and said, "We made up this story for following reasons," they were tried and several sentenced to death. Then their sentences were commuted, but sent to prison. They were defended by a group called the ILD, the International Labor Defense, which is the legal arm of the Communist Party, who sent lawyers to defend them. And this is some of the literature of the time. Remember, there's no internet, there's no television. This was a major form of communication, you know, the distribution of this literature. And the fact is, the lawyers who came to defend the Scottsboro Boys then went, and in the following year, following months, when Ned Cobb was put on trial in the shootout, he had been engaged with local sheriffs, they came and defended him. So he was fortunate that he wasn't lynched, fortunate there were people there to defend him, and they had. And here is now. This is a very interesting. Was a poster. It's in Russian and Ukrainian, and it's an indication of how, in fact, the Communist Party, not only in the United States but abroad, was using the story of the Scottsboro Boys and then of Ned Cobb and the sharecroppers. We see a swastika over the kind of police. And there's Ned smiling at us. When we met him, which was 60 years later, he was just as good looking, only his shoulders were broader from his lifetime of work. And I'll leave it at that and ask George and Dan and Liang to come up. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ted. Now's the most stressful part of the part for me, because moderating is very difficult, and I am more interested in the voices, in the commentaries of others than I am in myself. Why don't I first introduce the people who are on this stage with me, and I do have introductions to read. Liang de Beer. Also, I should say it's kind of a delight to have a multi-generational conversation about this book. me being, of course, very close to their age.
And me?
And you have many generations behind us now. We are both, well, Liang de Beer studied colonial history and the history of science at Leiden. And she joins us on stage with a great interest in Indian culture and an Asian Dutch identity, and is working on her first novel in which Chinese Indian main characters play a role in that past and future. We can ask a bit about that. And Dan is a writer and historian whose work often revolves around Ghana, and as well as the themes of history and faith. He's self-published 4 books: Kumasi, Amsterdam, Paris, and London. He has recently completed an MA degree in history at the University of Amsterdam with a thesis on the history and heritage of the Kwaku Festival in Amsterdam Zuidoost, and engages in oral history research himself. So we have the perspectives of storytelling and the perspective, or a kind of literary perspective, and a historical perspective, although I certainly do not want to reduce you to those categories. Thank you, Ted, for that history of the book and some of the perhaps surprising context, some of the perhaps surprising international resonances of the book. I think we will be particularly interested in the surprising translations of the book, things that we might deem untranslatable about a book of this sort, whether the surprising portability of this book. It's quite interesting to see this book as a field guide for certain kinds of national reckonings, a field guide for certain kinds of post-colonial reckonings, or a field guide for anything at all. Maybe the one question I'll ask you that's kind of a conceptual one, since we both hung up on this term illiterate. Maybe I have a kind of conceptual question before I put my co-panelists on the spot to respond and interrogate you. Working on this book in the way that you did, what did you come to understand about these categories, these constructed categories of literacy and illiteracy? I'm curious to have you start there.
Well, I'll tell you what I felt about him and in regard to literacy. He was deeply illiterate. I mean, he did not sign his name. And illiterate when it came to numbers as well. So that, for example, when you go out in the field and weigh the cotton, he could write down the numbers of what he saw on scale, and then he would bring it in the house, and his wife, who was literate, really literate, would do the additions. So his wife, by the way, had a brief correspondence with the White House, with FDR, wrote thanking the federal government for looking kind of after them. But, this book, Nature Nedcobb, I've got the names 400 people. 400. Who he crossed paths with in his life. If I start naming people, I think I stop. I can get past 4, but to 40, 50, it's really tough. And he was, I think, quite self-consciously remembering. I think I describe how one of the delights of the book is his use of mimicry, and it isn't just a for theatrical purposes. He had to know who was really friendly to him and who was not. Whom could he count on, who could he not? And I think, he didn't have any out-of-body source, to restore this information. And he worked very hard. And there were people who claimed, well, nobody could tell stories like this. But, people who are familiar with, for example, East Asian tellings, and Joseph Conran wrote about, well, you don't believe people could sit for 8 or 10 hours and tell a story? They certainly can, And he could, and he was telling them, not just for himself, so that if he would tell a story in a context of his say his brother's house, his brother would be sitting there and his brother's wife would be sitting there, and he would veer. They say, wait, Ned, no, come back and tell it this way. Come back and tell it that way. But he had this capacity to tailor a story for his audience. And it gets away from the question of literacy, but it doesn't get away from the question of how he sizes up people and how that was an important role of memory and of the cultivation of memory in the place of literacy. So to say someone is illiterate says, well, yeah, but what do they do? You know, what are the powerful things in their lives? And then you discover, well, I don't have that in my life.
I mean, it's partly the book's own many vocabularies. I mentioned secrecy, knowing, the book's own vocabulary. The book, maybe a couple times the book uses the phrase book learning, but it never uses the vocabulary of literate or illiterate. And these dispensing in a way with that binary is one of the effects of the book that I find quite powerful. Or seeing that dichotomy as classed, raced, however we want to call it. It also locates it specifically in the early 20th century and locates you as this curious go-between.
Well, I was he referred to our work as his report. And he was always hoping I would bring my report to the authorities, take that report and bring it. And by the authorities meant the people in Washington, you know. But he would do that also tongue-in-cheek, you know. What this report, and he knew what books were. Of course, there were books in his home. And actually, one of the slides I didn't show is. A few years ago, it was 2019, Auburn University, which is a university in Alabama, had a big ceremony where they planted a white oak tree in his name. He used white oak to make baskets, the kind of strip, and to look at the crowd who was there, his descendants, you know, which included 2 college teachers, a number of younger people who were in different schools, you know, at the time. So literacy was something he valued, but not for himself, in the same way that he valued the vote, but not for himself. He fought for schools. And there's that wonderful line from Booker T. Washington, who's describing Reconstruction. He says, on the Civil War, what was Civil War? What was Reconstruction if it wasn't a race for education? You know, from the point of view of the African-American farmer. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to retreat into the background a little bit and put our panelists on the spot. This is a chance to respond in whichever way you want. Maybe, Liang, I will start with you. You're new to this book. What struck you most vividly or most surprisingly? I'm also interested in both its resonance now and its historic specificity. 50 years is both a long time and not a long time. 49 years, I should say, is both a long time and not a long time. And clearly, as we've seen, this is one of these books that has cropped up it's been sort of translated across time in different moments. Now is one of those moments. The floor is yours. What questions would you ask our author?
Thank you for also this opportunity. And for me, it was also a discovery of the book. I didn't know it. Sorry. So this was a great chance, as what you told, to read the book for the first time. I just have a very first question. You didn't take any pictures of Ned Cobb when you were interviewing him?
No, I didn't.
What a shame.
I also didn't get any of his baskets. Fortunately, I had friends who came to visit me and who did both of those, took some pictures and got some of his baskets, which are treasured items now, which are, you know, in museums, which also would, I think, amuse him, you know, to know that. But did not take photos. Even though I regarded myself as, you know, I took photos of the environment, I took photos of Latvia. I didn't bring the camera to our. And I think I was very, very aware that, in some sense, I was, or to some people in his family and in the community, I was an intruder. I was coming in, and a camera was one more thing. My tape recorder. Who could understand what's this floppy old? It was actually a big old tape recorder, but the camera. I think I regarded as something that, I don't know, might stir up people. It was still a difficult time. When I was sitting and working with Netkov, the banker, who is Mr. Hope in the book, whose real name was Grace, was still in the bank, in the same bank, still making loans to two of Ned's sons, you know, in their business, and they wanted not to stir up a hornet's nest. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to tap into that. How the book resonated with me. What I found especially interesting is how the book was made, and how, like, the process of editing and translating, how that, and also how it resonates to us here now with the Dutch translation. And I'm always very interested in reading, like, the preface and the translator's note, to see, like, how was this book made. And I think this is such an interesting object of study, just to reflect on. We have Ned Cobb, who comes from this very rich oral tradition, and then you step in as sort of a witness and transcriber, but also bringing yourself, hearing the oral history, and then editing. You did some sort of editing, I suppose. And then the story coming to us in the Dutch version. And I think Dan and I both read the Dutch version. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to read the English version. And reading the Dutch translation was interesting in itself. As in, there were certain choices made. And what made it quite difficult for me to read the book. It was not a light read for me. Also because of the choices that were made in the translation. For me as a native Dutch speaker, like, choices were made to present Ned Cobb's way of speaking in some sort of Dutch, I don't know, farmer's accent, which I found difficult to digest. And yeah, so I was a bit lost in the translation in this whole process. At the same time, I also brought another book with me, which I read a month before, which is The Dorsons by Rolene Redmond. You might know it. Yeah. And she also wrote a chapter about, like, what is the context in these Afro-American, Atlantic tales of people who have experienced slavery and live in these societies. And that really gave me the context on, the way of speaking and the way of telling these stories. So reading these books together really gave me the context, which sometimes I was missing while reading through the kleur van katoen.
Now, I have written more about the editing process, and actually, if you have a chance to read this essay called...
I found that one really interesting. You shared,
Stepping Over Cockleburrs. I talked about both about kind of a little bit certainly about the editing process, but also about what happens when you take an oral tale and put it in and freeze it. So that if I say to you, well, Ned was always capable, he would tell his story one way for you and one way for you. Now it's the interpretation is going to fall on us. It's no longer in his bailiwick. He is not the person who's going to, tailor it. It's been hardened in that sense, and it's become a document, which it wasn't before, or in literal sense, it was something else. The editing process, it was incredibly fast work, because he spoke in whole stories. And I can remember the very first day we worked, when Dale and I met him, we were very anxious of just being in Alabama, and we were there for almost a week, And Dale was digging around in newspaper morgues, in the old courthouses, looking for records of the Union. And I would just say that people weren't, say, courteous and weren't particularly helpful. And finally, we drive up to this, in the countryside, and from about here to the back wall, we park our car, and this sturdy man is standing there with a live oak timber, and he looks out at these two kids getting out of a car. He raises his hand, and he says, "I always recognize my people when I see them, children. Come on in, come on in." So all that nervousness just melted away, and sat with him. And Dale asked one question. She said, well, Ned, why did you join the Union? And 8 hours, 10 hours later, we stood up, and we were shaking. And we were shaking. I mean, in that day, his sister-in-law had come and fed us 2 meals. He didn't get up to pee. He sat there talking. We had never been in the presence of anyone who had a command of language like this, illiterate, okay, had this command of language. And so when it came time to actually transcribe, I was the transcriber. There's no, and I had a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and I'm working away at transcribing. The stories came out whole. What did happen, though, is I would have several versions sometimes of a story. And I took it on myself to edit and to combine some details that were in one but not in the other. So, and to attempt to get, and that was part of the attempt to get what, remember, the great anthropologist Clifford Geertz called thick description. And one of the things that I would go back, one of the crises I had in writing the book, in doing the interviews, is I came to him with 100 pages of questions. Academic me had put together all about black life in Alabama, about diet, about religion, about music, about what. And at the end of the first day, I said, well, see, where are we going to start? Let's start in 1907, because here you are, his first farm. So I said, well, let's start, 1906. I said, 1906. He goes, 1906. And he spoke for 3 hours, and he didn't talk about 1905 or 1907, but 1906. And he described, and he had kind of for himself filed away who his landlord was, the name of his mule, how much cotton he had raised, what price he'd received for that, which of his children was born in that year, and all in the context of little stories, which he put together. So there was that, it came time to transcribe 1906, 1907, as we get on. Now, those years were clear. 1950, he didn't remember so well. 1960, kind of a blur. 1963, he remembered, because these scenes I showed from Birmingham, he had seen on television himself, But he didn't remember those in the context of that was his experience, of course.
Maybe I can. Maybe it's a good moment to put Dan on the spot as, I suppose, here the practitioner of what we are calling oral history, despite the inadequacies of that term. How does this relate to your own practices now? You could take that question or run with it in whichever direction.
Yeah, I'm going to run with it. I really had 2 questions and 2 remarks. My first question is, how did the whites and the black people in Alabama responded to you being a Jewish American? This is also something you take with you into the conversation with Nate. So, when I was reading, I was wondering, did Nate view you as just a white man coming to pick up a story, or did your Jewish identity had some influence in yours? Conversation?
That's a great question. It had a lot of power in his family. The Jewish people that he knew, had been in contact with in his life, were peddlers, were traveling merchants who came with, and he generally had excellent rapport with them, and would invite them but they could not, for example, we all have our glasses of water here, right? One day his wife had brought out a carafe and poured water, and I'd finished mine, and I picked up his glass and took a drink. And he went, "Whoa, nobody has ever done that." I said, "Done what?" And he said, "Drank from a white person drinking from a glass that I would drink from." And he had remarked to me, though this is not in the book, that they could not invite the peddler into the house to eat because they were worried of what the neighbors or what the neighborhood would think, you know. But we did remember him as Jewish. The lawyers who came down from the International Labor Defense Fund were all Jewish.
Yeah, I thought so, but he didn't mention it in his story.
No, he didn't mention it in the story. They talk about it themselves in accounts that they wrote of the time. And then in the later 30s, these same attorneys were very active when, as Hitler came, you know, when the nature of Hitler was becoming clear to everyone. They were by that time back in New York or whatever. But my being Jewish had an impact when I would come to visit, for example, his children who lived in different cities, who knew that I was Jewish, and I would come, and they wanted to know if I wanted any special food. You know, I wanted chocolate cake. I wasn't looking for, but their idea was a Jew was someone who ate his own food, you know, who didn't eat our food. I would say it's had more of an impact where I live now in South Carolina, where Dale and I moved to this village called McClellanville, South Carolina, in 1976, so just 2 years after the book, and we've been there ever since. And we are the Jewish community, my family, you know, right there. And it came out just last week. And I was in a village, and this is a coastal village. The industry of the village is seafood, shrimp, crab, oyster, clam, whatever. Most of the workers, they are not on, we have big political differences, to say the least, you know. And I had gone to the dock just to buy some shrimp. And one of the workers came out and says, "You guys are doing a good job, keep it up there." And he was talking about Gaza and Israel and saying, "Me? Well, I'm an American, I live right here, I'm not," and he was saying, "You're hitting those Arabs where we want you to hit them." And that was, so the first time I felt recognized as Jewish in this community, but it's clearly, and a second time, and that was actually an earlier time, I was very active in a group that was pushing to build a middle school, a school in the village of McClellanville. The village is gerrymandered, so whites live in one section, blacks live actually outside of the village per se. And the community, the white community, did not want this school in the village because it meant the black majority school would be coming into the white village. So the word in the general store was the Jews in Charleston had promised the niggers in McClellanville a school, and when the Jews and niggers get together, you can't stop them. So that was I heard that. And we did get in this context, it was a telephone, more than one, a phone call, and my son was about 9 years old. He picked it up. I said, "Well, who was it?" He said, "Dad, they're going to kill your Jew ass for blah, 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 blah." And we all burst out laughing. You know, that was my response. "Son, don't worry, don't, feel." So that, in that sense, it was recognized when I was causing some trouble. But when I went to interview Ned Cobb, and we thought, well, people were going to be upset about this, they were past it. That was old, that was history, that wasn't now. They wanted to know, and I mentioned this in the book, what's happening to our children? They're listening to this Negro music, they're dressing this way, they want this, what's that? They were more interested in the current moment, and I was not a threat to them there, whereas I am a threat in my village.
And my other question was about, you vividly described like the black rural life, but my I was wondering, like, what's left of that black rural life in those places, like physically, but also mentally. But do people like still think about that? Do they like? Are they nostalgic about it, or do they don't really remember those days?
Well, they're split right down the middle. In a way, it doesn't exist anymore, obviously, just as the mule farmer is not there in his tractor life. Cotton is still cotton. Everything as though is, very heavily mechanized, gone. Many of the cotton fields are now in soybeans, growing soybeans instead, or raising cattle instead. And anything that touches water, a lake, a river, is now upscale, white, vacation tourist communities, which used to be their, kind of part of that rural area. In Ned Cobb's family itself, 5 of his children moved north and 4 stayed in Alabama. And only 1 of the 9 children had a life in farming. For example, they, were going out. I'll say one thing kind of about that. And Ned, you look at the cotton field, and of course, it's oppressive labor and all. Ned loved looking at that cotton. That cotton was the strength of his arms was in that field and was in those plants. And that was beautiful to him. Seeing cotton bloom and July 4th, what did July 4th mean to the African-American farmers? They would show off their fields to one another. The straight rows, the whiteness of the cotton. To his son, for example, his son, Francis, in the book, looked at the cotton, and I was interviewing his son, Francis, in his home in Philadelphia. And he was also a mimic, like his father, very much. And he picked up as if he had a sack, to pick up. He said, picking cotton, how much of this white shit does it take to fill a bag? Well, his father would never say that. To his father, this was his wealth in some sense. So I think there's nostalgia only in a kind of romantic way, not among the children who
like, not only in this family, but like, how much is left of like this black rural way of life? Like,
that's a good question. 55% of African American people still live in the South. Okay, and many of those people live in what we call rural non-farm areas. So they're living in a rural context, in a village context, in which the church is still central to life, for example, but they're not farming. They're working in small industry, which is scattered all around. They're working in the new automobile plants, which have been built, to essentially to escape northern wages and factories which have come to the South. Yeah.
Can I ask you a short, maybe final question? We're celebrating 50 years of this book, and now it has a new audience with also the Dutch translation. Do you think the book aged well, and would you have written the same book if you would write it now?
Well, of course not. I mean, I was, I would say, luckily very naive. I had, I had what Ned would call, I had book learning, right? And I'd come, and I regarded him also as a hero of my, knowing, and I know a lot more now, and I'm sure it would influence me, tremendously. On the other hand, I'm very happy that the version of the book people have who read Dutch, has been prepared by Frans Kooymans. And I am going to say one quick knowledge. I can't read Dutch, but my Dutch friends who do said that Frans turned a masterpiece into a masterpiece. So I'm very proud of him. And I'm also really proud of, and I can hardly believe it, of Florian Jacobs, my publisher who is here, that he took the risk, a terrible business risk, of publishing this book. And I hope in the long run it turns out to be really good for him and for ISVW, for the publisher.
I would love to. I think we have time to gather some questions from the audience, and I'm sure there are. Several. A couple of things while you're gathering your thoughts that have occurred to me. One, the surprising detail about the first Hungarian translation itself, casting the language into a certain kind of Hungarian peasant speak. I wonder if, I mean, this is a predicament of all kind of regional speech, or this book is pointedly not written in any kind of dialect, but it does have a regionalism about it. What Dutch regionalism looks like is an interesting question. That's one of the things. But then also, the timeliness of the book is something we've approached, and we've made it, the book seems quite timely in the moment, but when you read it, it becomes powerfully untimely. I think your question is an excellent one, where you isolate what's true about this book is that, on one hand, it's a modernization story. This is a modernization story, recovery of a lost world, a world that was itself lost in 1971, this muled farmer in a tractor world, as you put it. Therefore, when you read it, the arrival of new technology is extraordinary. The automobile plays a role in this narrative that I hadn't expected when I embarked on it. So if you're going to read it, I would read it for its timeliness and its pointed untimeliness. Maybe we can gather some questions. And
let me just say one thing about the automobile. In a lot of ways, this is an American success story, or would have been up to point. By 1932, Ned Cobb had owned 2 automobiles. What American, never mind farmer, never mind black farmer, owned 2 automobiles? You know, he was making it, and the whole purpose of him going out and standing off against the deputy sheriffs who had come to take his neighbor's livestock. Yes, he was burdened by this oppressive history, but he wanted most of all to hold on to his property, to keep his children around him, to keep his sons on the farm, to keep them. And that was a losing fight. And it was both his defeat in that and his victory. Because if they were to become independent and strong like him, they had to break with the forms of their father, just as he had to break with the forms of his father. Yeah.
Other questions? I see one in the back. The microphone is coming your way.
Can everybody hear okay? What I noticed, like, it's so fascinating how his story is essentially, and how you wrote it and published this, is essentially a bridge to that time. And I find that hearing you now recount what you experienced, you are now a bridge to that time. So there's sort of like a bridge to a bridge. And I wondered, because it's so fascinating hearing you speak on this topic, have you written about what you wrote about? Because you've just now also discussed staying in contact with the family and what they have gone through. That's my question.
Nice question. I have written an essay, actually, which I gave these fine people to read, called Stepping Over Cockleburrs, but I wrote that really in 1979, so it was only a few years after the book, in which I talk about the people more and talk about kind of that interaction. I'm very close. One of my really close friends is one of Ned Cobb's granddaughters, and she wanted very much to come, but she's actually not. She's not well and couldn't make it. And we have done something together where we take a stage together, and she reads aloud from her mother's narrative. Her mother's one of Ned's daughters, and I had interviewed the mother and never published that work. And I'll sit there being the kind of geeky historian who gives a little of the history, and then Shirley reads from her mother's tale, which is very, very, very powerful. And we're going to do more. She and I have talked recently. We want to do more of that as a way of getting more of the material out, but also of getting more of the children's point of view out. The children's point of view not only on growing up under Ned, but as you discover when you do oral history, if you start talking to someone about their parents, they want to talk about themselves. You know, they have lives, you know, and that's something that, for a number of reasons, one of the models I had in working on the book was a series of books by a man named Oscar Lewis, who is a sociologist, anthropologist, who wrote several books about impoverished families. Two in particular, one called Pedro Martinez, and one called I'm missing the title now, but two books of the two.
Remembering the title.
Yes,
yeah.
two Mexican families, one urban, one rural, in which he interviewed the whole families. And I had this grandiose idea. I would interview Ned, his 9 children, his brothers' children, and we'd have a little library of books. Didn't happen. Most of the interviews happened, but the book production did not. But I think getting the point of view of the children out, in particular, and the children who both stayed in Alabama and the children who went north is an important thing to do. And let's see how much longer I can, you know, keep doing. Yeah.
And I can pass along the citation of the essay he's referring to. It's in a book called "Telling Lives: The Biographer's Art," that I can send you as well. More questions? I'm sure there are others. I have one that I would, but I know you have more. This was so. We can see the kind of layered historical resonance of this, and I imagine myself in your position in 1971, assembling this book with a certain distance, as you note, from one climax of the civil rights movement, but writing also in the wake of, the kind of immediate wake of anti-war movements. And while the Vietnam War remains, there's the ongoingness, the kind of dreary ongoingness of the Vietnam War. Reading it, I imagined, I read Nate's account of World War I to resonate in that way. If I were going looking for parallels, and I wondered if in your account of, in gathering Nate Shaw's account of World War I, whether that resonated or whether that was, is that too obvious a connection? I'm thinking about generational experiences for scholars and generational experiences of writers, and that struck me as an interesting parallel.
I don't think I had anything in mind. It's quite seriously not. I will say one thing though. In my second book, which I'll bring out, my second book is a book called Tomby, Portrait of a Cotton Planter, and it's a biography not of a cotton farmer. Oh, it is a cotton farmer, but it's a white planter, slave owner, from 1840, who kept a diary from 1845 till 1861, till the beginning of the American Civil War, and I wrote a biography of him and kept a diary as well. And readers said, you know, you've written the same book twice. That is the same kind of rise and fall, relationship with the sons and come. It's happening in this white privileged family, and it's happened in this tenant farm family. Now, is that you, or is that the reality of it? You know, so that's a question that sticks with me. You know, I say, well, that's what I found, but was I projecting what I, you know, a story that essentially I had to tell.
Mm-hmm. I know you both.
Let me ask, if Liang has a particular question about translation, the translator is right here, and if seriously, if you had a question that, you know, about doing this translation, I'm sure Frans would give an answer. Is that? Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have a mic? Oh, yeah, there's a mic.
Good.
Yeah, I was curious. yeah, can you elaborate a bit on your choice of the vernacular to use in the Dutch version of the regionalism?
Okay, for one thing, I lived in the U.S. In northern Florida back in the late '60s, early '70s. I'd moved down to Tallahassee. Tallahassee, the city where Governor DeSantis resides at this very time. So I lived in northern Florida for about 10 years, and I felt I was knowledgeable about the southern black dialect. And originally, when it was back in 1975, I picked up the All God's Dangers when I was living in Miami at the time, and knowing the southern black dialect, I was able to read it quite comfortably. When translating it, when deciding when deciding that the translation into Dutch would be quite suitable at this time, I was obviously confronted with with having to decide how to translate it. I had heard from Ted, about the Hungarian translation, which was into basically a defunct Hungarian dialect. But would that suit an audience in the Netherlands? I might have to decide, would it have to be into some Amsterdam dialect, or the street language that is used in by Moroccan or Turkish people living here. Well, my decision was basically to translate it in such a way that the whole story of Nate Shaw would be understandable to a Dutch public. There was also the need I needed to decide how to deal with terms like colored people, blacks, Negroes. Because those the terms they appear numerous times in the whole story. In general, I decided to use to speak about blacks, but occasionally. You find in the book also that Nate Shaw, talks about his black compatriots. He sometimes calls them niggers also, especially in a negative sense. And in such a case, I decided to keep the term in the Dutch translation also.
Thank you. Let me say something about one quick thing about dialect. I grew up in a world of dialects: Yiddish dialect, Polish dialect, German dialect, all the Italian dialect. All the people I grew up with spoke in a dialect. No one spoke the English of, say, white Anglo-Saxon New England English. I grew up always hearing dialect. When I work with Ned Cobb, I never for a moment felt something was strange or something was difficult because of how something was pronounced or, the syntax of it. Just another way of speaking English. It's sort of a feeling I have when I read, for example, Nigerian English today. It's beautiful English. It's English. It's Nigerian English. Yeah. It's not a dialect. In a sense, I think dialect is a word. And in fact, it was right after World War I, University of Michigan sent teams of people to study dialect in different parts of the country out of the fear that American English was becoming homogeneous. one. And they came to this very section of Alabama where Ned Cobb lived, and they wrote back. They were really discouraged. They couldn't tell the difference between white English and black English. What are they going to... And sure, the white farmer, the black farmer, they lived next door to one another, dressed the same way, worked the same way, went to different churches, but very similar, and spoke the same way. And I think a lot of the separation of white and black in America today is more a recent creation. It is not how life was and was experienced, certainly years ago.
Which gets at some of your question earlier about that history.
I did find it, I did consider it important, to retain as much as possible in the Dutch translation, the oral character. So, so it would not be, the Dutch that you would find, in a regular, in a standard novel, but it's oral history, and that I try to reflect that as much as possible in the translation also, in the spelling and in the so that the intonation of the speech would resound as much as possible in the translation.
Did Dan want to say?
Yeah, did you want further to add?
Not on this point, but I think I have a lot of remarks. I'll just stick with one. I was really fascinated about Nate talking a lot about his father, and also like condemning his father for being unfaithful to his mother. But later on, he also tells us about him being unfaithful to his wife. But before, he was like, when I was reading, I thought he was condemning his father and living a better life than his father in regards to being faithful. But then he goes like, yeah, I also cheated, but it wasn't really cheating. So I found it really funny how his relationship with his father like developed. Yeah. Also, his father being really violent, and him not being violent to his children. I thought there was really a book about like father-son relationship and also about faith. And yeah, I don't think this is a question.
Well, he did call that, when we talk about father's negative behavior, he would say that was the old ism in him. And he used that word ism to refer to slavery. And of course, I mean, I say this as a son who fought against his own father. I didn't want to be like my dad. I loved him, but I also realized I was fighting against him. And that's certainly what Ned was doing. And there's this one very beautiful story where they go to rescue the children of his deceased sisters, and how he meets his father, and they have this agreement of how the children should be divided, and he's clearly very close to his father and very admiring of him as well. So I think he had the usual ambivalent attitudes of a son to his father.
Yeah, so
and ambivalent behaviors.
Yeah, so yeah. I want to end with, so if you haven't read the book yet, it's only if you if you're not really interested into like the whole history, it's worth to read only. My English is so like a peasant level of English, but like it's. I'm gonna say in Dutch. Oké, het is gewoon het lezen waard. Alleen al om die relatie met die vader, want dat is echt schitterend om te lezen.
Yeah.
Great.
I think we have. This means we have come, I believe, to the end, or are we?
Yeah.
We're now at the end, I believe. I don't know what the cutoff point was. It was terrible
20 minutes ago.
Terrible moderating for me.
No, is that there was one story when Ned was telling me something, and he said, "Oh no, that happened when I was an old man." Oh, what am I now? So yeah, we passed the end some time ago.
We passed the end some time ago, but I want. I see one question. Onze laatste vraag kan natuurlijk in het Nederlands.
Zijn er nog meer boeken zoals deze over die tijd vertaald?
Are there other books such as these?
Translated in English?
Similar books in the sense of In the sense of oral histories, or
Yeah.
in the sense of It's a good question. Geen idee.
Well, the book I brought, it's a totally different context, and it's like a recent book. But I think, if you read in Dutch, then I can really recommend this one, because it's also an oral history, and also with lots of characters, and she also quotes like 400 life stories, and it's it comes from the same oral tradition. She has a totally other way of delving into this. It's colonial Suriname, so it's a Dutch history book. But I found a lot of parallels with Ted's book. So if you liked All God's Dangers, I think The Dorsons is your next read.
I'll, Well, no, I will. I mean, this is the first kind of full-length like a kind of autobiography of a sharecropper.
Yes,
it has that status.
White or black.
And itself is written. If we were to find earlier oral histories, we would look first to the WPA narratives from the 1930s, which were oral history, more kind of less formally imaginative. Oral histories gathered in the 1930s of formerly enslaved. Is there anything else you would add to the canon?
Only that many of the people who were documentarians, who wrote, what we learn about is about the documentarian. Yeah. So that if I think of a book like "Let Us Now Praise Famous Men" by James A.G. and Walker Evans, it's a study of several white sharecropping families. And by the way, they're white because the original publisher said, we'll get a bigger audience if it's white than if it's black, okay? Mm-hmm. What we learn is all about their own process and their own experiences, which are very interesting to learn about, but we never hear from the people themselves. Yeah.
Your book is an example of the history of below.
Yes.
I wonder how much influence does it have on all the historians?
How much influence on other historians? Other historians, I'm trying to think of other work. There is a lot of biographical work, but not work that relies on the autobiographical, on interviews and on materials themselves, these kinds of materials. Very, very little. Whether we're talking, and has nothing to do with race. Whether white family, black, and much of the original commentary, or that I got in the way of correspondence, people who had read the book when it came out were from white farm families, who said, "Well, that sounds like my grandfather. That sounds like my family," who were recognizing that commonality, but it hadn't been done for them. But could have been, should have been.
Could have been.
Yeah.
I have a last thing to say.
You have the last word, and then we retire for drinks.
Like the tip and question. After reading this book, I watched on Netflix the movie Mudbound. I don't know if you know it.
Which one?
Mudbound.
No, I don't know it.
It's from 2017. It's about a sharecropper, like almost the same theme as your book.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, do you know if it's kind of based on your book?
And no, I don't. Okay. I don't, but I do know. I do know several movies that stole little pieces.
Okay,
but,
okay.
That's
Did you enjoy those movies?
A movie, but this book?
Yeah, that stole pieces of your book. Did you watch those movies?
For example, the movie. What was there was a whole series of Roots, the Alex Haley series. There was one episode that was taken right out of here. Yeah.
Without credits.
No, nobody ever contacted me. Of course not.
Allow me to.
One thing, I have a sister-in-law of mine. Lives in sister-in-law of mine. She told me that her father grew up in Alabama, and he was in a very poor environment, and he eventually was able to make his way up through work in the army and all. But she emphasized that the fate of poor black people and poor white people were quite similar. She claims it was more the rich white people, the bankers and landowners, that they very much I just can't think of the word now. But they not criminalized, but they acted down, on both, both blacks and whites. They were the ones that suffered most.
Yeah, but it was very common for white landowners to prefer having black workers than white workers, because they could control them in more ways than one. You had essentially and that was true across the South. At no time in American history were there ever more in number black sharecroppers than white sharecroppers. White sharecroppers, and so there's a myth that sharecropping starts after the American Civil War. No. There were large sharecropping populations in North Carolina, in Tennessee, before the war. And these were people, again, who had who were non-landowning whites who were working for white landlords. Yeah.
The sign of a good conversation is that it does not want to end. Yeah. But I will thank you all for coming on a rainy night. This is a wonderful turnout for a book that is not easy to reduce to something, and that is its greatest strength. On this point, our narrator arrives at one of the more powerful diagnoses of precisely this, precisely the question on which we have ended. Yeah. So I can recommend it. Being a fresh reader of the book.
Thank you. Yes.
And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Liang. Thank you, Dan.